My name is Diana Weston. I am 38 years old. And on the morning of March the 4th, I was sitting in the passenger seat of my own car, in the parking garage of the Savannah Marriott Riverfront Hotel, watching my husband shake hands with a woman who was wearing a bracelet I had never seen before. They did not kiss. They did not touch beyond that handshake. But the way they looked at each other, that 2-second pause before they stepped apart, told me everything I had spent 14 months refusing to believe. I did not cry. I did not get out of the car. I did not call his name. I sat perfectly still, the way you go still when a very large animal walks past and you understand instinctively that movement will make things worse. My coffee was still warm. I remember that detail precisely because I held it in both hands and focused on the heat until my breathing slowed. Garrett pulled out of the parking space in his black Lexus GX at 8:47 in the morning. I watched his tights disappear around the corner. Then I picked up my phone and called my attorney. What Garrett did not know, what neither of them knew, was that 6 weeks earlier, my Aunt Ruth had passed away in her home in Charleston and left me an estate valued at just over $5 million. He knew about the inheritance in the broadest terms. He knew Ruth had money. What he did not know was the full amount, the structure of the trust she had created, the specific legal protections built into that document, or the fact that my attorney, Frank Delgado, had already drafted a prenuptial addendum that I had not yet signed. And he did not know that 3 days before I sat in that parking garage, my smart car's Bluetooth system had picked up an incoming call that Garrett had taken while sitting in the driver's seat. A call from a woman named Amber Fuller, a call that lasted 41 minutes. A call that my car recorded in full audio and uploaded automatically to the cloud account linked to the vehicle. He had borrowed my car. He had forgotten it was not his. This is that story. Before I tell you what was in that recording, I want to ask you something. If you are watching or listening to this right now, I want to know where in the world you are. Drop it in the comments below, your city, your country, what time it is there as you listen to this. There is something about knowing that stories like this reach people in different time zones, different seasons, different lives. That reminds me why telling the truth out loud matters. And if you connect with stories about women who refused to be erased, women who built their futures in silence while the people who underestimated them kept celebrating too early, please like this video and subscribe to Revenge Chronicles. We put out a new story every single day, and the next one might be the one you needed most. Let me tell you about the life I had built before the morning in the parking garage. I grew up in Beaufort, South Carolina, the younger of 2 children raised by parents who were both school teachers. My mother, Carolyn Greer, taught 3rd grade at Ladies Island Elementary for 26 years. My father, Donald Greer, coached varsity baseball and taught history at Battery Creek High School. We were not wealthy. We were careful. My parents owned their home outright by the time I was 12, drove cars until they stopped running, and treated a dinner out at Applebee's as a special occasion. What they gave us instead of money was something more durable. They taught us to finish what we started, to be honest even when honesty was costly, and to never, under any circumstances, let someone make you small. My father's sister, my Aunt Ruth, was a different story altogether. Ruth Calloway had married a man named Harold Calloway when she was 24 years old. Harold was a commercial real estate developer based in Charleston, who had, by the time I was born, turned a modest business inheritance into something substantial. Ruth was not a passive figure in that success. She had a degree in accounting from the College of Charleston, and she managed Harold's books and then eventually his entire portfolio with a precision that earned the respect of people who had initially dismissed her as nothing more than his pretty wife. When Harold died in 2011, Ruth inherited everything. She spent the next 13 years managing it herself, growing it, and deciding very deliberately what would happen to it after she was gone. She had no children. Harold had no children from a prior relationship. What Ruth had was a clear mind, a strong sense of justice, and a long memory. I was the niece she called every Sunday. I was the one who drove down to Charleston on her birthday without being asked. I was the one who sat with her through her 2nd round of chemotherapy in 2018, bringing containers of homemade soup and not saying anything when she wanted silence. Ruth was not sentimental about it. She did not make speeches. What she said, one afternoon in October of 2022, sitting on her back porch with a glass of sweet tea and a view of the Wando River, was this: "Diana, you are the only person in this family who has ever treated me like a human being instead of a line item. I want you to know that I have not forgotten that." I thanked her. I changed the subject. I did not ask what she meant. I met Garrett Weston at a fundraising gala in downtown Savannah in the summer of 2013. He was 31 years old. He was 6 feet tall with dark hair going gray at the temples, and he wore the kind of easy confidence that reads as charisma, until you know him well enough to see it is actually a finely tuned performance. He was a senior account manager at a regional wealth management firm called Palmetto Advisors. He talked about his clients with a discretion that seemed professional, about travel with enthusiasm, about himself with just enough self-deprecation to seem grounded. I was 30 years old. I was working as a marketing director for a mid-sized hospitality company called Coastal Table Group, managing brand strategy across 9 properties in the Georgia and South Carolina Low Country. I was good at my job. I had built something real. I was not looking for someone to complete me. I was looking for someone to keep up with me. Garrett seemed like that person at first. We married in May of 2015 at Forsyth Park in Savannah. 62 guests, catered by a restaurant I had worked with professionally. String lights in the live oaks, my mother in pale blue and my father trying not to cry during the father-daughter dance. It was a good wedding. The years that followed were not bad, exactly. They were, and I see this clearly now, a slow, careful erosion. Garrett had a way of responding to my professional successes that felt supportive on the surface but contained, just beneath it, a faint note of diminishment. When I was promoted to vice president of marketing at Coastal Table Group in 2017, he took me to dinner at the old Pink House, ordered champagne, and said, in a tone that he believed was affectionate, "My wife, the overachiever, always has to be the smartest one in the room." He laughed, I smiled, I noted it. In 2019, I was recruited away from Coastal Table Group to lead the marketing division of a boutique hotel development company called Tidewater Properties. The base salary was $114,000 per year, plus performance bonuses. I was at that point earning almost double what Garrett was making. He did not celebrate that transition. He said, "I hope the commute isn't going to become a problem." There was no commute. The office was 12 minutes from our house. He knew that. I noted it. In 2021, when I mentioned to Garrett that Aunt Ruth's health was declining and that I was planning to visit her in Charleston more regularly, he said, "You know she's probably going to leave everything to some charity. Don't build your expectations up." I told him that I was not going to see Ruth for the inheritance. I was going to see her because she was my aunt and she was sick and I loved her. He shrugged. He turned back to the television. I noted that too. Garrett had a habit I had documented over years without ever quite letting myself name it. He had a way of inserting himself into conversations about money, mine, anyone's, that was just subtle enough to seem casual. He would say things like, "When we eventually have more liquidity," or "when our financial picture looks different," using the word "our" for resources that were entirely mine, and "I" for decisions that affected us both. It was the grammar of a man who had already decided that the boundary between mine and his was a formality that did not apply to him. I noticed it. I did not confront it. I stored it. The formal notice of Aunt Ruth's passing came on February the 9th. She had died at home, in her own bed, in Charleston on February the 7th, at 6:22 in the morning. Her attorney, a woman named Patricia Ames out of a firm on Broad Street, called me directly. She told me that Ruth had left a detailed will and a revocable living trust, that I was the primary beneficiary, and that the estate's total value, inclusive of the Charleston property, the investment accounts, and 2 additional rental properties in Mount Pleasant, was approximately $5,140,000. She asked if I was available to meet the following Thursday. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the Tidewater Properties office building for 11 minutes after that phone call. I did not cry. I was not sad in the way people might expect. I was something closer to reverent. Ruth had seen something in me that was worth that kind of trust, and I understood, sitting in that parking lot, that my first obligation was not to celebrate but to protect it. I called Frank Delgado from that same parking lot. Frank had been my personal attorney for 6 years, handling contracts, the occasional employment dispute, and the legal review of my own lease agreements. He was 53 years old, methodical and unhurried, with an office on Drayton Street, and the demeanor of a man who had heard everything twice and still managed to be surprised by nothing. I told him about the inheritance. I told him I wanted to understand exactly how to protect it. He said, "Diana, let's sit down this week. Bring whatever Patricia Ames sends you." We met on February the 14th, Valentine's Day. Garrett was taking me to dinner that evening. I did not tell him I had spent the afternoon with my attorney, discussing how to ensure that a $5 million inheritance would remain entirely mine. Frank explained the relevant law with the patience he always brought to explanations. Under Georgia law, an inheritance received by one spouse during a marriage remains that spouse's separate property, so long as it is not commingled with marital funds. If I deposited any portion of the inheritance into our joint checking account, or used it to pay our shared mortgage, or allowed it to be titled jointly in any way, it could lose its protected status. Frank had drafted a document he called a post-nuptial property agreement, an addendum that would formalize the separation of this asset. He recommended I have Garrett sign it. "You don't have to," Frank said. "The law is on your side without it, but it closes every possible argument." I took the document home. I set it in the drawer of my home office desk. I did not yet give it to Garrett to sign. I had not told Garrett the full amount. He knew Ruth had died. He knew there was an inheritance coming. What I had said carefully was, "Ruth left me something. We'll know the full picture in a few weeks once probate starts." He had nodded and said, "Whatever it is, we can figure out how to put it to work." That "we" again, automatic, reflexive. I said nothing. I was listening now with a different kind of attention. It was on February the 28th that Garrett borrowed my car. His Lexus was in for a service appointment at the dealership on Abercorn Street. I was working from home. He took my car at 8:15 in the morning and returned it at 4:40 in the afternoon. He said he had been at the office. He said it was a long day. He seemed fine. He made dinner. He asked how my day was. What I did not know until 3 days later was what had happened in my car between 8:15 and 4:40. My car, a 2022 Volvo XC60s, syncs automatically to the cloud account associated with the vehicle profile. It logs call history, audio interactions, navigation, and, because I had activated the advanced safety package, it stores audio from calls taken through the car's Bluetooth system for 30 days. I had turned that feature on in 2023 when I started taking long client calls while driving to Charleston, so I could play them back and catch details I had missed. It was a practical tool. I had never imagined it would capture anything like what I found when I logged into the Volvo app on March the 3rd. There were 4 calls logged from February the 28th. 3 were short. 1 lasted 41 minutes. It had been placed at 11:17 in the morning. The contact name it listed was A. I pressed play. I will not describe every word of what I heard in that recording, but I will tell you the part that mattered most. Roughly 8 minutes into the call, Garrett's voice, his actual voice, the voice I had listened to for nearly 14 years, said the following: "Amber, listen to me. I'm telling you, this changes everything." Her aunt left her the whole thing. We're talking about $5 million, maybe more. She doesn't even know how to manage money like that. She's going to need help, and once I get her to put me on as co-trustee, it's basically ours. There was a brief silence, then Amber's voice, higher than I expected, said, "You really think she'll do it?" And Garrett said, "Diana trusts me. She always has. That's her problem. That's her problem." I listened to that sentence 4 times. I did not cry. I did not scream. I got up from my desk, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood at the window looking out at the Spanish moss on the live oak in our front yard for approximately 2 minutes. Then I went back to my desk, opened my laptop, and forwarded the audio file to Frank Delgado with a single line of text. "Frank, please listen to this when you have a moment. I need to talk to you this week. Something has changed." Frank called me back within 2 hours. He had listened to the whole thing. His voice when he called was measured, careful. He said, "Diana, I want you to come in tomorrow morning. and I want you to bring the post-nuptial document I gave you unsigned." I asked him why. He said, "Because what I have just heard is audio evidence of financial predation on a marital estate, and I want to make sure that when you decide what to do next, you are protected 6 ways from Sunday." I slept 6 hours that night. Not bad for the circumstances. The following morning, March the 1st, I sat across from Frank in his office on Drayton Street, and we talked for 2 hours and 20 minutes. He walked me through every option with the same unhurried precision he always brought to complicated situations. He told me what the recording established and what it did not. He told me what I would need to file, what I would need to preserve, and what I should not do under any circumstances, which included confronting Garrett before the strategy was set, signing any joint documents, or moving any funds. "Right now," Frank said, "you have the advantage of information. He does not know you know. That advantage disappears the moment you react." I asked how long it would take to get everything in order. He said he needed approximately 2 weeks to prepare the petition and coordinate with a forensic financial consultant he used. 2 weeks, I said. Fine. I went home. I made dinner. I asked Garrett how his day was. He told me about a client meeting. He asked if I had heard anything further from Patricia Ames about the trust. "Still in process." He nodded. He poured himself a glass of wine. He seemed perfectly relaxed. He had absolutely no idea. The nights during those 2 weeks were the hardest part. Not because I was falling apart. I was not. But because sleeping next to someone who has betrayed you, while knowing that they do not yet know what you know, is a very strange kind of isolation. It is not loneliness exactly. It is more like being in a room with a person who is speaking a language they believe you cannot understand and listening to every word. I lay still on my side of the bed each night and thought about Ruth on the porch in Charleston, and about my mother grading papers at the kitchen table in Beaufort, and about every woman I have ever known who held herself together in a situation that could have broken her and did not let it. I thought, I come from a long line of people who finished what they started. This is something I am finishing. Garrett, for his part, behaved during those 2 weeks in a way that would have been convincing if I had not already heard the recording. He brought home a bouquet of white tulips on March the 5th without explanation. He suggested we go to the farmer's market on March the 8th. He asked, twice, whether I had heard anything more from Patricia Ames about the timeline of the inheritance distribution, and each time I said, "Still working through probate. These things take time," and each time he nodded with the patience of a man who believed he could afford to wait. He could not. But he did not know that yet. He was moving around our house, making coffee, leaving his shoes by the door, living inside his own certainty. And I was there with him, completely present and absolutely elsewhere. That was the moment I stopped being the wife who trusted and started becoming the woman who knew. There is also something I have not yet said about that walk from the parking garage to my car on March the 4th. After Garrett's Lexus disappeared around the corner, I sat for about 4 more minutes, and then I walked to the elevator and pressed the button for level P1, and stood in that elevator alone and looked at myself in the scratched metal panel that passed for a mirror, and said, out loud, quietly, to no one but myself, "You already know what to do." I did. That is the thing about having spent your whole professional life making precise decisions under pressure. When the crisis is personal instead of professional, the muscle memory is already there. I was not starting from zero. I was applying the same skill set I had used to manage marketing budgets, negotiate contracts, and steer brand strategy through a pandemic to the situation of protecting myself from someone who had decided I was manageable. I had been managing things my entire career. I was simply switching the subject. During those 2 weeks, I kept returning to a single question I could not quite answer. How long had it been going on? Frank said it was not necessary to establish a timeline for the divorce proceedings. The recording was sufficient. But I am someone who needs to understand the shape of things, and so, in the evenings when Garrett was watching television or out running errands, I went back through what I could access. Not his phone. I had no desire to touch his phone, but our joint credit card statements from the past 18 months, which I had always had access to and had simply trusted him to be honest about. I printed 22 sons of statements and went through them with a yellow highlighter and a cup of tea at my desk. What I found was not dramatic. It was mundane, which was somehow worse. 14 months of restaurant charges at places I had never heard of. On evenings he said he was working late. A hotel stay in February of the previous year for a property in Savannah's historic district, 2 nights, a Saturday and a Sunday. On a weekend I had been in Charleston visiting Ruth. A spa charge in Hilton Head in September that he had never mentioned. None of these were large amounts. None of them screamed. They whispered, and what they said was, "This has been going on for a very long time, and you were never supposed to know." I added the statements to the folder I was building for Frank. Under Georgia law, they constituted evidence of dissipation of marital assets, $11,400 across 14 months, documented and admissible. I also made one other quiet move during those 2 weeks. Ruth's trust had been established with a bank in Charleston, administered through Patricia Ames's office, and the funds were not yet fully distributed. On March the 5th, I wrote a formal letter requesting that all correspondence and documentation related to the trust be directed exclusively to my personal email address and my attorney of record, Frank Delgado, not to my home address, not to any account accessible through our household. I also notified Patricia that there was an ongoing marital dissolution and that she should make no disclosures to any third party regarding the trust's timeline or distribution. Patricia Ames sent me back a one-line response. Understood completely. Ruth would approve. I did not cry when I read that, but I held the phone for a while. During those 2 weeks, I continued every normal routine with a precision that required genuine effort. I went to work. I submitted a campaign brief to the Tidewater Properties Board on March the 4th, the morning after I'd sent the recording to Frank, and I did it without a single error and with a clarity of mind that, in retrospect, I think came from having finally made a decision I had been approaching for years. I had dinner with our friends, a couple named Marcus and Gail Thornton, on March the 6th at a restaurant on Whitaker Street, and I sat across from Garrett and watched him refill my wine glass and laugh at Marcus's stories, and I thought, he is performing ease. He has always been performing ease. The difference is that now I can see the seams. I had lunch with my closest friend Sophie Marchetti on March the 9th at a cafe on Bull Street that we had been meeting at for 6 years. Sophie is 40 years old, a landscape architect with her own firm, and a talent for reading people that I have always envied. I told her a partial version of what was happening, not the recording, not Frank's involvement. Just, something is wrong in my marriage, and I am handling it. Sophie looked at me for a long moment across the table. Then she said, "Diana, you are the most controlled person I have ever met. That either means you're fine or you are absolutely not fine and no one will know until you're ready." I said, "The second one." She put her hand on mine. She said, "Call me when you need me." She did not order dessert. She understood instinctively that I needed to leave on time, to arrive home at the hour I always arrived, to maintain the surface of the life I was about to change. That is the kind of friend she is. That is the kind of friend everyone in a situation like mine deserves. The afternoon of March the 3rd, before I sent the audio file to Frank, I drove to Forsyth Park, where Garrett and I were married, and I sat on one of the iron benches near the fountain for 34 minutes. It was a Tuesday afternoon, just after 3 o'clock. There were children playing near the fountain, a woman walking a large golden retriever, a college student reading on the grass. None of them looked at me. I watched the fountain, and I made a decision. I had already made it the moment I heard his voice on that recording, but I needed 34 minutes of fountain and live oaks and ordinary Savannah afternoon to make it feel real. When I stood up to leave, I felt, for the first time in what might have been years, like the ground was entirely solid underneath me. Frank filed the initial petition for dissolution of marriage on March the 3rd. It was served to Garrett's office address, not our home. Frank's suggestion, so that I would not be present at the moment of service. The petition included a formal notice that certain marital estate documents had been preserved as evidence, and that the petitioner's separate property inheritance was claimed as non-marital under Georgia statute. The third attachment was the audio recording, transcribed in full, time-stamped, flagged by a forensic audio consultant who had certified it as unedited and authentic. We had also learned, through a quiet inquiry Frank arranged, that Amber Fuller was a junior wealth advisor at Palmetto Advisors. She had joined the firm 14 months prior. She worked in the same office as Garrett. She was 29 years old. And there had been an internal report filed 6 months earlier by another employee regarding what that report described as inappropriate interpersonal conduct between a senior account manager and a junior advisor. The report had been noted, filed, and not acted upon. Frank incorporated it into the documentation. He said, "This is relevant. If you have been listening to this and you are still with me right now, I want to pause here for just a moment and speak to you directly. If you are a woman sitting somewhere right now who is carrying something heavy, something you have not told anyone, something you are managing quietly and methodically, while the world around you continues as though nothing is wrong, I want you to know that I see you. I know how much energy that takes. I know that composure, in moments like this, is not the absence of feeling. It is the choice to protect your future instead of relieving your immediate pain. The comments section is yours. Tell me what you are carrying. Tell me where you are in the world right now. And if this channel has ever given you something, a moment of recognition, a breath of solidarity, please subscribe. We will be here tomorrow, and the day after that, with another story just like this one. Now, let me tell you about March the 22nd. Garrett called me at 2:17 in the afternoon on March the 12th, the day he was served. His voice was stripped of its usual ease with an undercurrent of recalibration, like a man who has just discovered that the room he thought he controlled has different walls than he realized. He said, "Diana, what is this?" I said, "It's a dissolution petition, Garrett." He said, "I can see what it is. I want to know what you think you're doing." I said, "I am protecting my inheritance and ending our marriage, in that order." A long pause, then, "This is completely out of nowhere." I said, "No, it isn't." He began to talk faster, his practiced composure beginning to slip. He said, "Diana, we can talk about this. Whatever you think you know, we can discuss it like adults. You don't need lawyers." I said, "Garrett, all further communication needs to go through Frank Delgado. You have his number on the petition." I hung up. I sat for a moment in the quiet of my home office. Then I picked up the post-nuptial property agreement that I had never given him to sign, looked at it one final time, and put it in the shredder. I did not need it anymore. The inheritance had never been commingled. It was protected by law. The public moment came not in a courtroom and not through any drama I had engineered. It came because Garrett engineered it himself. On the evening of March the 22nd, Garrett's parents, Raymond and Susan Weston, hosted a dinner at their home on Skidaway Island. Raymond was 68, a retired civil engineer. Susan was 65, a former elementary school principal. They had been married for 42 years. They did not know about Amber Fuller. They did not know about the recording. From what I gathered through Sophie, who had heard it through mutual friends, Garrett had told them that Diana had filed unexpectedly, that Diana was making accusations, that Diana was trying to take everything he had worked for, the version where he was the reasonable one and I was the unstable one. Raymond called me on March the 20th and asked if I would come to dinner. He said it in the tone of a patriarch who expects that the invitation itself is sufficient cause for attendance. I told Raymond I would think about it and call him back. I called Frank. Frank said, "You don't have to go." I said, "I know." I called Raymond back and said I would be there. Because I had spent 14 years attending their family dinners, and I was not going to allow Garrett to reframe the story unchallenged in the one room where his version would otherwise go uncontested. I arrived at the Weston home on Skidaway Island at 6:45 on the evening of March the 22nd. I was wearing a navy wool blazer, dark trousers, and a pair of simple pearl earrings that had belonged to Aunt Ruth. Inside, Raymond and Susan, Garrett's older brother, Daniel Weston, 43, and his wife, Patricia, Garrett's younger sister, Meredith Crane, 35, and her husband, Tom, and Sophie, who had at my quiet request received an invitation from Susan, who liked her and did not think twice about it. 12 people at the dinner table. I had asked Sophie to come because I wanted one person in that room who knew the truth before the evening started. Garrett was already there when I arrived. standing near the fireplace with a glass of bourbon, and the look he gave me when I walked in was the most layered expression I have ever seen on another person's face. And that I had come. Suspicion about why. Calculation about what I might say. And beneath all of it, the old ease, the belief that he could still manage the room if he moved quickly enough. He could not. Dinner proceeded for the first 40 minutes with the careful performance of normalcy that families under pressure specialize in. Garrett talked too much, which was its own kind of tell. He made jokes, he refilled glasses. He touched the back of my chair once when he walked past, a familiar gesture he had no right to make, and I did not react. I ate my dinner, I was pleasant, I was composed, I was exactly what he expected. Then Susan turned to me and said, in the gentle voice of a woman who believes she is managing a situation, "Diana, we just want to understand what happened. We all care about you. We hope this can be resolved." There was a general murmur of agreement from around the table. Garrett looked at me. I set down my fork. I folded my hands in my lap. I looked at Susan and then at Raymond, and then, calmly at the whole table, I said, "I appreciate that. I'll tell you what happened," and I did, not loudly, not with anger. I told them, in complete sentences, that I had discovered my husband was involved with a woman from his office, that I had audio evidence of a recorded phone call in which he explicitly described a plan to gain access to my $5 million inheritance, that my attorney had filed documentation of this plan with the divorce petition, and that I had made the decision to end the marriage and to protect the estate that my Aunt Ruth had entrusted to me. I said all of this in the tone of someone describing a transaction. The room was completely still. Garrett said, "Diana, this is not the place." I said, "You invited me here to explain what happened. I'm explaining it." Raymond said nothing. Susan's hand had gone to her mouth. Meredith was looking at her husband with an expression I will not attempt to describe. Daniel set his wine glass down with a precision that indicated he was choosing not to say something. Sophie looked at the table. She did not look at me. She did not need to. Garrett tried once to offer an alternative framing. He said, "There are things about this situation that you don't know, that you haven't heard my side of." I said, "I heard your side in your own words, Garrett. In my car." On February the 28th. At 11:17 in the morning, 41 minutes, he went absolutely pale. I watched the color leave his face the way water leaves a glass when you tip it over. Slowly at first, and then all at once. No one at that table said anything for what felt like a very long time. Raymond spoke first. He said, "Garrett," just the name, nothing else. But the word contained everything. Susan began to cry quietly. Meredith reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said, "Diana, I'm so sorry." Patricia looked at Daniel. Daniel was looking at his brother with an expression of someone who has suspected something for a long time and is now watching the confirmation arrive. I finished my water. I thanked Raymond and Susan for dinner. I picked up my coat, said goodnight to each person by name, and I left. I sat in my car in their driveway for 3 minutes before I started the engine. Then I drove home. The bridge over the marsh was lit up against the dark water. There was a half moon. I turned on the radio and found something quiet, and I drove the rest of the way in the specific kind of peace that comes, not from winning, but from being finished with something that needed to end. The divorce was finalized on July the 15th. The financial outcome was exactly what Frank had predicted. The inheritance, all $5,140,000, was protected in full as my separate non-marital property. The marital estate was divided according to standard Georgia equitable distribution guidelines. Garrett received what the law entitled him to, and nothing beyond it. His attempt, through his attorneys, to claim a portion of the inheritance based on his contribution to the marital household lasted exactly 2 weeks before Frank presented the full transcription of the recording, at which point the attempt ceased. I heard later that Amber Fuller had left Palmetto Advisors in May. I did not look into where she went. After the divorce was finalized, I took a week and drove alone up the coast. I spent 2 nights in Beaufort, where I grew up, and had dinner with my parents on the front porch with sweet tea and my mother's lemon chicken. My father asked how I was doing, and I said, "Better than I've been in a long time." And he looked at me for a moment in the particular way fathers look at daughters when they are deciding whether to ask the next question, and then he just said, "Good," and passed me the cornbread. That was enough. That was exactly enough. In the weeks after the divorce was finalized, I received 2 communications from Garrett that are worth mentioning. The first was a voicemail, left on an evening in late July, in which his voice was careful, measured, and entirely unlike the confident ease I had listened to for so many years. He said that he was sorry. He said that he had made serious mistakes. He said that he hoped I was well. There was a pause at the end, and then he said, "I underestimated you, Diana, I know that now." I listened to the voicemail once. I did not call back. The second communication was a card, handwritten, mailed to my home address. The card said simply, "I'm sorry for all of it." I put it in the recycling bin. Not out of cruelty. I believe he meant it, or the version of it that people mean when they have been caught and have run out of alternatives. But an apology from someone who was sorry they lost is not the same as an apology from someone who understands why what they did was wrong. I did not need the former. I was no longer waiting for the latter. I have thought often, since the divorce, about what I would say if I could speak directly to the woman Garrett was with during those 14 months. I would not say anything angry. I do not have anger for her specifically. I do not know what she was told. I do not know what version of me she was given. What I know is that she was young and she was inside a story that had a narrator she could not verify, and that is a precarious place to be. What I would say if I could is simply this: know the facts of the situation you are in before you make it yours. Know whether the ground you are standing on is actually solid, or whether someone else built it and is the only one who knows where the cracks are. That is advice for everyone, in every situation. I learned it the hard way. I am not sorry I learned it. On those 3 nights in Beaufort, after the cornbread and the quiet conversation on the front porch, I walked the neighborhood where I grew up. Twice I passed my old elementary school on Mossy Oaks Road. Dark at that hour, the playground equipment lit faintly by a street lamp at the corner. I used to sit on the swings there and think about what my life would look like when I was grown. I thought it would be bigger, louder, more defined by achievement and its visible markers. I did not imagine it would feel like this, like something stripped back to its essential structure, simplified by loss and